I'm so thrilled to see all of you. New people, old faces. Barbara T. Smith, we are so honored to have you. And Bill Roper, where are you? Bill, way in the back there. The tubist. It's tubist. Who knows what a tubist is? Marlene? Yeah. And Linda and I go way, way back. I've been in a contest with people. They say, I know Linda for so many years. I said, well, I met her in 1988.
Right. When Lisa, my daughter, was 9 years old and started studying harp. And Victoria was her harp teacher.
But the harp is very difficult. It's 80 pounds to carry around. All my boyfriends, they had to pass the test. Could they move the harp? And none of them passed, no. So it's much easier carrying a pen. I've been writing about the arts for a long time, and there are a lot of people here who have read me and new people to come. So we're thrilled to have you all here, and you will introduce May.
Yes. And as Victoria said, we're so happy to have Barbara T. Smith and Bill Roper. And our first presenter is May Shan Chu, who is a good friend of mine. We presented at Photo LA a couple of years ago, twice in a row.
Yes, you did.
Yes, with some of the work that you see here, and then some new work. And she's been at Art Basel in Switzerland twice now, and Miami Art Basel, so she's really doing wonderfully, and I'm so happy for her. And we're just so happy you're here today. Thank you so much, and sharing your wonderful work.
Okay. I'm not quite sure where to start, so I welcome any and all questions. If something doesn't seem clear or just about my process and what my work is about. Before I forget, please check out my show at Kopecken Gallery in Culver City. It's going on till April 19th. And if anyone would like a personal tour, I would be happy to show you the show. And it's got a work that really shows where my direction is right now. It's an accentuation of my existing work. But this work comes from a series called Let a Thousand Flowers Bloom. And just giving you this sort of the umbrella narrative that's behind everything. In 1957, Mao made a declaration where he quoted a classical Chinese poem, and he said, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend," meaning that in a great society, free expression should prevail, and that's what makes a society great. And as a consequence of that declaration, he started the 100 Flowers movement, and academics and artists and people who had different ideas came out of hiding, and there was a brief flowering of culture. And there is a controversy between the East and the West, because my work is ultimately about identity and culture, how it intermingles. Whether or not Mao ultimately couldn't handle the criticism, or whether he had, tried to get the foxes out of the holes, like he had been quoted, been heard saying that before. But the people who did come out of hiding must have known that it was going to be ultimately a fatalistic move, but they wanted to believe in this beautiful idea of a society. And that's what the work is about. It's about living in this sort of utopian ideal, whether or not there's a dystopian reality. And it is a mock annexation or invasion of the U.S. by the Chinese. But all the actors in the photographs are American, and they are artists or academics specializing in Chinese culture, so they would be the very group targeted in the 100 Flowers movement. The Chinese Cultural Revolution era uniforms come from a Beijing photo studio where cultural revolution propaganda is reenacted by the tourists for souvenirs. So what the work is about ultimately is about how our sense of who we are culturally and just simply this need for self-invention, how it shifts and how it changes and how it's affected by this increasing globalization and the monoculturalism that results from it. When I grew up in Indonesia as a third generation Chinese Indonesian minority. And at the time that I grew up, being Chinese was illegal. So we weren't allowed to have Chinese names or speak Chinese or practice any Chinese traditions. And as a result, we really forgot who we were. I mean, I went to a family reunion, and there were 100 people there, and I asked them, what their Chinese names were, because my name is what was on my birth certificate, but we had to change it twice because of government regulations. So I've had 3 birth certificates, but only half of them remembered what that was. And of the half that remembered, only half still remembered how to write it. So for instance, my name, Mei Shanchu, is not really a true Chinese name because it's also been through so many filters, because we were a Dutch colony, and so it's an Indonesian Dutch Cantonese version of what the name used to be. It's sort of like when you tell someone something, and that person tells someone something, and it goes around in a circle, and what happens at the end. And in many ways, that's what's happening to us and how we perceive ourselves and our ideas of culture. I think as globally, our ideas of our own unique culture is becoming more and more defined by how other people see us, because we're getting so separated from whatever indigenous roots that we ever had, as urban citizens. So that's in a nutshell. That's what the work is about. I can go on and on and on. My process is I come from a painter, as background as a painter. So my process in terms of photography is very painterly. It's not how most people photograph or most photographers photograph. I tend to look at one piece in and of itself. A lot of photography is you look at the whole body of work and that's how you make sense of what the work is about. And I tend to approach every piece on its own. It's more the way a painter would approach a piece. And there are very, very thick layers of pigment that's on these clear substrates. And that buildup, if you look on the other side, there's it's quite velvety, almost like a painting. And in my more recent work, I put them in these what looks like 3D souvenir boxes. But even here, I couldn't carry the big boxes, but even here you could see that there's an image that you get another image on the other side. When I was 5 years old when I was living in Indonesia, we had been converted to Catholicism. I grew up in a really post-colonial, setting, and also on the equator. And so from 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. every Sunday, we would walk to the only really Western building was a cathedral, and the missionary was there. And at 6 a.m. every Sunday, the light would go through the stained glass, because we would walk in the dark for an hour, and the light would go through the stained glass. And it was like nothing we'd really ever experienced in the rest of our lives. So to me, it held this kind of a magic promise of the West. And then when I came to the States in response to this great genocide that happened, I went to China 5 times to look for what Chinese culture really was about, because I had been so defined by this as a child. And then in China, they are so quickly trying to really kind of take off, almost like taking off a garment. They're what they viewed as outmoded, and so these ideas of tradition they felt was anti-modern. They were searching for. They wanted to embrace progress, and progress to them really was about the West, right? So you have, like in my photographs, you have these women wearing these qipals, which are traditional Chinese garments, which in China people don't wear because they consider them outmoded and anti, you know, sort of a outmoded, provincial, sort of anti-modern. And so you had these cultural invasions going on, and so much of, for instance, in so much of the world, there's the hall, you know, with the cinema and LA, and you know, this city actually has a huge effect, and they're embracing these kind of Western ways of life, and you have a lot of these cultural influences that are sort of coming at each other, and then how do the Chinese end up defining themselves at the end? Probably by the way other people define them, and this is happening not just there, but in other places in the world. And so, essentially, that's what the work is about: is this need for self-invention and how our interior selves are constantly shifting, even though we believe that we are this sort of stable individual who has this kind of impermeable sense of self. So, are there any questions? I just keep running on and on and on. So, can you hear, or am I? I'm not putting it close enough to.
Can you talk about each of the paintings and tell us who they are and what's going on in them?
Sure. I get to know my models quite well, because to me they're what they're going through psychologically is very important, because what comes out of their eyes is really important in the work. There was a curator who did a studio visit who said that my work was very, very non-Chinese, because a Chinese person would never photograph this way, where you have the subject looking so directly out to the viewer. And also because my work is also a commentary and a little bit of a joke on Chinese contemporary art, you know, what's censored, what's not, you know, things which, that's why hence the military themes and some of the, some of their ideas. Their art tends to be about the oppression of the West and exile and some other things, but this is kind of the flip side to that. This piece here, this is a fairly new piece in the last couple months, I would say, and there's on her feet there's a certain type of foot bondage, you know, which I use a lot of symbolism in my work, and I try to create new symbols and defy expectations people have to an image. And also my work tends to have this very feminine undercurrent. I'm not going to say post-feminist because I've been corrected, but it has this idea about the feminine, how women are perceived, and it's quite subversive, and to challenge the viewer a little bit in terms of history. Yes. Yes. I think it's an unusual view for that. So there's a lot of morphing of genders in the work. I think even the male subjects tend to be quite feminine. I play a lot with notions of gender. Not really the politics of gender so much as this kind of idea of the power of certain genders. In here, there's a very young soldier in front of a cathedral, one of the cathedrals in one of the small towns in Germany, which was quite important to World War II, and he's holding a mouse little red book, and raising ideas of belief and religion, and you know, how that gets regurgitated and changed. And I tend to also like to deal with how we view iconography, and how certain things have been embedded in our minds to mean other things, and how that sort of gets into the popular stream. I mean, I'm fascinated by social media and what that does, and how things which had a certain importance, like Mao, his image is now, it's like there's one photograph I have where there's a lot of the Mao badges, these little red buttons, and it's next to a woman in lingerie, and she's standing in the doorway, and these badges in that picture were from a souvenir stand, and now they're being sold, for a quarter each or whatever. But at some point they have certain meaning, but they've been regurgitated and they become part of the popular culture, like so many other things. There's someone told me that there's a restaurant in St. Petersburg where they have Frida Kahlo's on the wall, but she's like in gold, and some people got quite agitated, quite angry, but this is sort of a way of her being able to insert herself in that situation. I mean, a subversive way of getting certain ideas across, or maybe not, but here we have, yeah.
When I saw it for the first time, I was immediately struck by the history of the Cultural Revolution, of how the young people informed on their parents. Right. And, the aftermath of that was horrendous, because they were eventually, in prisoner of war camps and things, and their children lived with a legacy of having terribly, terribly inflicted horrendous things on their parents, for this faith of the Little Red Book.
In this picture here, he's holding a dog tag, and I think I just wanted to relate to what you were saying, with the very young soldiers, is that I tend to relate the notion of the soldier. This was quite influenced by Shakespeare, believe it or not, and Hamlet, and the different portrayals of Ophelia, floating in the water, which really kind of was a defining image in the age of Romanticism, and my work tends to have this contemporary Romanticism to it, but and the sacrifice of the innocent, in a way, which to me in contemporary society is a lot of the soldiers who are quite young, and they really don't have a notion of what they're being sacrificed for. So that's why I do tend to use them in terms of very, very young soldiers, because most soldiers actually are quite young. And here the flower, which is in most of my work, tends to have a lot of flowers, because it's about the 100 Flowers movement, and also flowers are such potent symbols, especially in Asian culture. Here, if you remember during the peace movements, where there was the flower that was used on guns, and that was sort of flowers instead of guns. But here, he has the flower in his mouth, and it resembles a wound, and also it stops him from talking as well. So those are just little discussions on the individual images themselves.
Can I just mention a funny story about the internet? I got a lipstick Mao, Warhol, who did the lipstick, and I stood in front of it. We hung it up in our kitchen, actually, in Houston. And I thought this was a lovely photo of me. So I put it on as my profile picture on Facebook. Now, this was my very, very, very early years with Facebook. That was when it was still open and the Chinese had not discovered it, and so they were freely able to use, those who had it could use it. I got a message immediately from someone in China who said, in a bit of broken English, but got it across very well, "Do you realize how disrespectful this is?"
Well, that's exactly true. And yeah, there is this there's a change where we're constantly reinventing ourselves in these different ways, and we're using these symbols like helter skelter and regurgitating them, and they just get reconstructed and reformed. my new work really emphasizes certain components of what I was doing, and it really emphasizes the hybridistic, dualistic components of it, of interculturalism, and actually of the self in contemporary culture, in contemporary society. A lot of the views of Chinese of this kind of mock Chinese culture that I portray in the work, of course, is fantastical because I was never exposed to it. So it's a completely self-invented culture, which is not so different from what is happening around the world in terms of how people view themselves and each other. Yeah.
Can you describe the process?
Um,
How do you actually get this? Is it plastic or is it glass? And is it photographic? But how do you actually get it onto the medium?
well, for these pieces, I don't always do work like this, by the way. But for these pieces, they're printed directly on a clear substrate, and because I wanted it also to have that feeling of stained glass and of a three-dimensionality, and I wanted to have the light to play such an important role in terms of how the image changes. Light representing ideas of truth or identity and sort of how things shift. So my work tends to have this kind of astigmatism to it, that it changes a little bit from different points of view. In a very diffuse light, the photograph would not have this backlight, back image. And then it depending on where the light hits the image, it would change. You see the eyes on the other side of his eyes. And if it was a direct light, the image would be in the back and the piece would look completely three-dimensional. It just depends on the play of light, which gives it this kind of temporal quality to it. It's printed using these kind of UV type pigments, which are the most eco-friendly type of photography, and it can handle a lot of bright sunlight. So this I could put this outside for 5 years, and the image would be bright. I mean, the substrate would disappear, but yeah.
So what you're really, this is like industrial backlit, like what you have on a bus shelter.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. I use a lot of industrial processes. I also do lenticulars and and light boxes, and I want the photography to look something between like something precious, like in a church, and also something quite industrial and that people would see on a daily basis. Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess that's it. Nope. No, I was born in Indonesia. Third generation. No, we were. It was illegal to be Chinese in Indonesia. We had our own ideas of what Chinese food was, but it'd be very different from what it is in China because it's been really. Did I move anywhere else? Well, I first came when the situation of the Chinese in Indonesia has been compared by scholars to very much to be like the situation of the Jews pre-World War II Germany. So every few years there would be some kind of action against the Chinese. There was a great genocide where, I don't know, you guys might have seen the new film that came out about Indonesia, the documentary. But there was a great genocide where 2 million people were killed, and there were a lot of, mass graves, and it was hidden for a long time, and there was a huge amount of propaganda. Like there was this constant propaganda that was inflicted on the population to the point where most Indonesians to this day don't really know what the truth is. So when my parents decided that they were going to leave, even though they were belonged to a very small group of Chinese Indonesians who believed in assimilation, and so we were protected by the local population from these killings. The Islamic holy man took my father around the village for a day to show people that he was a friend of Islam, even though we were Catholic. And then when we came to the States, my parents went through this kind of cultural shock because they came from a very conservative country. It's 80% Muslim to and suddenly they thought, wow, we actually have choices in terms of who we are, how we identify ourselves, and my mother had this. She started thinking, do I even want to be a mother? Do I even want to be a wife? Because that was kind of an expected thing for a woman. I think that's why I deal with these kinds of things in my work. So she disengaged herself from my father, and she and my father gave all their children away. She gave my younger sister up for adoption to these two physicians in North Carolina. My brother was given to my aunt because they always wanted a son and said, this is your son. And I was my older sister and I were a little older. I was already 4, so they didn't know what to do with us, so they sent us to my grandparents. And so then we lived in this little village with my grandparents in the middle of Java. Yeah, in Temanggung. It's very close to the Borobudur, the Buddhist temple. It was, it was the best part of my childhood. It's in Indonesia, in a small village. You believe in everything. Magic is real, science is real. You believe in the church. You believe in the shamans. When there's no rain, you pray, and then you call the witch doctor. And so there's this kind of fusion between fiction and reality, and there's a lot of stories. It's kind of like the magic realism that you find in a lot of these kinds of places. And I think people live like that these days. We get constant barrage of information and stories, and sometimes it all kind of blends together. But to answer your question, so that's where I was. And then my mother decided that, well, maybe she did want to be a mother. Maybe she did want to have a family after all, after a few years. And so she had disappeared to Florida. Nobody knew where she was. She, to this day, does not remember those years. She doesn't remember even going there. She'll deny that she ever went. She's completely blanked out these years of her life. And she said to my dad, oh, I'll take you back. And so then came the process of trying to get all of us back, which was really difficult because there were legal battles, there were. So, 6 to 7 years later, we were brought back to the States. And then, with my parents, and then my father joined the Air Force, and then we lived all over the country. This is kind of a symptom of people who've had displacements or even diasporic displacements, because I've heard from other, like Venezuelans get this all the time, because so many of them have been displaced from their country. So my father, after joining the Air Force, would move and move and move. So sometimes we'd be in a place for a month, and sometimes we'd play in a place for 6 months, and sometimes a year. He kept wanting to go someplace warmer. We were in Niagara Falls, and we ended up in Southern California. He almost moved to Hawaii, but then he quit the Air Force. That's why I'm here. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of little play upon the plays. It's a thing. Yeah. Well, I think I've taken up a lot of time.